He was one missed payment away from losing everything. So why did he open his door to two strangers freezing in the night? On a freezing night in Detroit, Isaiah Brooks, broke, overlooked, and one step from losing his home, opened his door to a desperate elderly couple he didn't know. They seemed lost, but not ordinary. As suspicion grew around him and the world turned against his choice, the truth stayed hidden until days later when a powerful billionaire arrived asking for Isaiah by name. And everything about that night was suddenly revealed in a way no one saw coming. The wind howled like something alive outside Isaiah Brooks's apartment, clawing at the cracked window frames, slipping through every gap it could find. Snow piled up along the narrow Detroit street, burying old cars and swallowing the sidewalks whole. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting a dull orange glow over a neighborhood that had long been forgotten. Inside, it wasn't much warmer. Isaiah sat on the edge of a worn-out couch, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped tightly as if holding himself together. His breath came out in faint clouds. The heater had been making strange clicking noises all evening, threatening to give out at any moment, and the electric company had already sent their final warning. One more missed payment, and everything would go dark. At 42, Isaiah had learned to live with silence, with struggle, with the quiet kind of loneliness that didn't scream. It just stayed. A folded military jacket hung on the back of a chair across the room. He hadn't worn it in years, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away either. It was one of the few things that still reminded him of a time when his life had direction, when people had looked at him with something other than suspicion. Now, most days, they barely looked at him at all. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:43 p.m., Friday. The end of another week that felt exactly like the one before it. His stomach tightened as he reached for a half-empty can of soup sitting on the coffee table. Cold. He didn't bother heating it. The gas bill wasn't worth it tonight. Outside, a gust of wind slammed against the building, rattling the door. Isaiah exhaled slowly, staring at the floor. Just another night, he muttered under his breath. Then, a knock. Sharp. Sudden. Out of place. Isaiah froze. For a second, he thought he imagined it. Nobody knocked on his door. Not in this building. Not at this hour. Another knock came, louder this time. Urgent. Desperate. His head lifted slowly. The wind outside roared again, but this sound cut through it. This wasn't the careless knock of a neighbor. It wasn't the impatient bang of a landlord. It was something else. Something pleading. Isaiah stood up, every movement cautious, deliberate. His body still carried the instincts he had learned years ago. Listen first. Move second. The knock came again, faster now, almost frantic. His jaw tightened. "Who the hell?" he murmured, taking a step toward the door. He paused halfway across the room. A familiar voice echoed in his mind, one he had heard too many times since coming back from overseas. "Stay out of trouble. Don't get involved. You already got enough problems." He glanced toward the window, where the storm raged harder, the snow coming down in thick, relentless sheets. Another knock, weaker this time. Isaiah swallowed. His hand hovered near the doorknob, hesitation gripping him like ice. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and looked through the peephole. What he saw made his breath catch. An elderly couple stood in the hallway, barely able to stay upright. The man, thin and hunched, wore a light coat that looked completely useless against the cold. His gray hair clung damply to his forehead, his face pale and strained. One arm wrapped around the woman beside him, as if he were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. The woman looked worse. Her lips had turned a faint shade of blue. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she clutched at the man's sleeve. Snow had melted into her hair, leaving it wet and tangled against her face. Her eyes, red, swollen, darted toward the door as if she knew someone was there. As if she knew this was their last chance. Isaiah's chest tightened. He stepped back from the door, running a hand over his face. "This ain't my problem," he whispered to himself, pacing once across the room. "You don't know them. Could be anything." Another knock. Softer. Slower. Almost fading. Isaiah stopped. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the door as if the storm itself was trying to push them inside. His eyes drifted back to the peephole. He looked again. The woman swayed slightly, her grip loosening. The man tightened his arm around her, but even he looked like he was running out of strength. They weren't just cold. They were breaking. Isaiah closed his eyes for a brief second. 6 months ago, after everything fell apart, he had knocked on doors too. Not like this, but close enough. Friends who didn't answer. Family who told him to figure it out. People who looked at him like he was a problem they didn't want to deal with. He remembered the feeling. Standing outside. Waiting. Hoping someone would just open the door. He opened his eyes. His hand moved before his mind could stop it. The lock clicked. The door creaked open just enough to let a rush of icy wind flood into the room. The couple flinched at the sudden movement. The woman looked up first, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Please." Her breath trembled in the cold air. "Please, can we come in, just for a little while?" Isaiah stared at them. At the shaking hands, at the exhaustion etched into every line of their faces, at the quiet, desperate dignity they were still trying to hold on to. He felt the weight of everything pressing down on him, his empty wallet, his unpaid bills, the warnings, the loneliness, the fear of making things worse. He had nothing to give, nothing at all, and yet, he stepped back. Opened the door wider. "Come in," he said quietly. The words left his mouth before he could take them back. The couple exchanged a brief, disbelieving look. Then they moved. Slowly. Carefully. As if stepping into something fragile. As if stepping into hope. And Isaiah, standing there in the dim light of his cold apartment, had no idea that this single decision, this one open door, was about to change everything. The cold came in with them. It rushed through the apartment like an uninvited guest, biting at Isaiah's skin, slipping under his shirt, making the small space feel even more fragile than it already was. He shut the door quickly, pressing his palm against it for a moment, as if to hold the storm outside. Behind him, the elderly couple stood just inside the threshold, unsure whether they truly belonged there. Snow melted off their coats, dripping onto the cracked linoleum floor. The man's breathing was uneven, shallow. The woman leaned heavily against him, her legs trembling like they might give out at any second. Isaiah turned slowly. "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward the couch. His voice was steady, but his eyes stayed sharp, watching every movement. The man nodded faintly. "Thank you, he muttered, his voice hoarse, each word scraping out like it hurt to speak. Isaiah stepped forward and took hold of the man's arm, guiding him carefully. Up close, he could feel how cold he was, like touching ice through fabric. The woman followed, her fingers brushing briefly against Isaiah's wrist. They were freezing, not just uncomfortable, dangerously cold. He helped them onto the couch, then immediately moved away, creating distance again. Not out of cruelty, but caution. Years of experience had taught him that kindness didn't mean losing awareness. He walked to the thermostat and turned it up higher than he should have. The old unit clicked in protest. He ignored it. The man hunched forward, hands clasped together, trying to stop their shaking. The woman leaned back slowly, closing her eyes for just a second too long, like her body was trying to shut down. Isaiah grabbed the only thick blanket he had, a faded one folded over a chair, and draped it over them both. The man pulled it tight around the woman first, then himself. That detail didn't go unnoticed. "You should have worn something heavier," Isaiah said. Not harsh, just confused. The man let out a dry, tired breath. "We didn't expect this," he said weakly. The woman opened her eyes again, forcing a small, apologetic smile. "We thought we could make it," she whispered. "We were wrong." Isaiah studied them. Their clothes were clean. Not new, but not worn down like people who lived on the street. Their shoes were decent quality, though soaked through, and there was something in the way they carried themselves, even now, that didn't quite match the situation. They weren't used to this. Not at all. "Name's Isaiah," he said after a moment. The man looked up. "Edward," he replied. "This is my wife, Margaret." Margaret gave a small nod, her lips still trembling. Isaiah glanced toward the kitchen. "You eaten?" They exchanged a look. That was answer enough. He walked over without waiting for permission. The can of soup he'd been about to eat earlier was still sitting there. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then picked it up and grabbed a pot. The burner clicked as he turned it on. Gas. Still working, for now. Behind him, the silence stretched, broken only by the low hum of the heater trying to catch up and the distant howl of wind outside. "You live alone?" Margaret asked softly. Isaiah didn't turn around. "Yeah." "No family nearby?" He stirred the soup slowly. "Not the kind that shows up when you need them." She didn't respond right away, but something in the way she looked at him shifted. Less like a stranger, more like someone who understood exactly what that meant. The soup began to steam. Isaiah poured it into 2 mismatched bowls and carried them back carefully. He handed one to Edward, who accepted it with both hands, like it was something precious. Margaret took the other, her fingers still shaking, though slightly less now. "Careful," Isaiah said. "It's hot." Edward nodded. "Hot is good," he murmured, almost to himself. They ate slowly, quietly. Each spoonful seemed to bring them back just a little more. Isaiah leaned against the wall across from them, arms folded, watching, waiting. He noticed things, the way Edward held the spoon, steady despite the shaking, the way Margaret sat upright after a few minutes, posture correcting itself instinctively. The way they spoke, measured, polite, almost formal. Not how people spoke when they were used to asking for help. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires crunching through the snow. Its headlights swept briefly across the window. Isaiah's eyes flicked toward it, then back to them. Margaret set her bowl down halfway through, pressing a hand lightly to her chest, breathing more evenly now. "Thank you," she said again, this time clearer. "You didn't have to do this." Isaiah shrugged slightly. "Didn't have to not do it either." Edward let out a faint, tired chuckle. "That's a rare way of thinking these days." "Not really," Isaiah said. "Just depends who you ask." A faint buzzing sound broke the moment. Isaiah reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. A message. From his landlord. His jaw tightened as he read it. "Final notice. Payment overdue. If not received by Monday, eviction process begins." He stared at the screen for a long second, then locked it, slipped it back into his pocket like it didn't matter. But it did. Everything did. Margaret had noticed the shift in his expression. "You're going through something too," she said gently. Isaiah met her eyes. For a moment, something raw surfaced there, something tired, worn down, but still standing. "Ain't everybody?" he replied. No one spoke after that. The heater finally kicked in properly, a low, steady hum filling the room. The cold began to retreat, slowly, reluctantly. Edward finished his soup and leaned back, closing his eyes for just a second. Margaret kept watching Isaiah, not judging, not pitying, just seeing him. And that, more than anything else, made him uncomfortable, because people usually didn't look that closely. Not at him. Not anymore. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the windows again. Inside, 3 strangers sat in a small apartment that barely held together against the storm, and none of them yet realized that this night was only the beginning of something far bigger than any of them could imagine. The warmth came slowly, not enough to chase the cold away completely, but just enough to bring color back into Margaret's face and steadiness to Edward's hands. The heater hummed like it was working overtime, pushing out uneven waves of heat that barely reached the corners of the room. Isaiah stood where he was, arms still folded, watching them the way a man watches something he doesn't fully trust yet. Margaret finished her soup first this time. She set the empty bowl down carefully, like she didn't want to make a sound. Then she shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket around Edward before settling back again. That detail didn't go unnoticed either. "You always take care of him like that?" Isaiah asked, his voice low. Margaret glanced at Edward, then back at Isaiah. A faint smile crossed her face, tired, but real. 53 years, she said. Some habits don't go away. Edward let out a quiet breath, eyes still half closed. She's been keeping me together longer than I deserve. Isaiah nodded once, but said nothing. He pushed himself off the wall and walked back toward the kitchen, rinsing the empty pot under a weak stream of water. The pipes groaned in protest. Everything in this place felt like it was holding on by a thread. Just like him. Behind him, he could hear Margaret shifting again. Her movements more controlled now. Not frantic like before. Not desperate. Calculated. He turned the faucet off and wiped his hands on a worn dish towel. Something wasn't adding up. People who were lost, truly lost, didn't calm down this fast. They didn't regain composure like that. They didn't sit straighter after a few minutes of warmth, like they'd simply stepped out of bad weather instead of out of danger. Isaiah walked back into the living room slowly. Edward had leaned back against the couch now, his breathing deeper, more even. Margaret sat upright beside him, her eyes scanning the room, taking everything in, not like a guest, more like someone assessing. "You said you were lost," Isaiah said, breaking the silence. Margaret looked at him. "Yes." "In this neighborhood?" he asked. "On a night like this?" A pause. Just a second too long. Edward shifted slightly. "We were trying to get somewhere," he said. "Where?" Isaiah pressed. Margaret answered this time. "We had an address." "Had?" She nodded slowly. "It didn't lead where we thought it would." Isaiah narrowed his eyes slightly. "That's a long way from wherever you started," he said. "And people don't just end up here by accident." Margaret held his gaze. For a moment, something passed between them, something unspoken. Not fear, not guilt, control. "We made a mistake," she said quietly. "A serious one." Isaiah didn't respond right away. Outside, another car rolled past, slower this time, too slow. The headlights cut across the window again, lingering just a second longer than they should have. "Wow." Isaiah's eyes flicked toward it, then back to Margaret. "You got anyone looking for you?" he asked. Edward tensed slightly at that. Margaret didn't. "No," she said. Too quick, too certain. Isaiah exhaled through his nose. He walked toward the window, just enough to shift the curtain slightly. The street outside looked empty, but the snow was still falling thick, covering tracks almost as soon as they were made. Still, something didn't feel right. He let the curtain fall back into place. "You can stay tonight," he said, turning back toward them. "But come morning, we figure out where you're going." Margaret nodded. "That's more than fair." Edward murmured something in agreement, though his eyes were already drifting closed again. Isaiah stepped closer now, noticing something he hadn't seen before. Edward's sleeve had shifted slightly, and there it was. A watch. Not flashy, but unmistakably expensive. Old, well-crafted. The kind of thing people didn't lose unless something had gone very, very wrong. Isaiah's eyes lingered on it for a second, then moved to Margaret. She saw him notice, and for the first time, something in her expression changed. Not panic, but awareness, like she knew exactly what he was thinking, and didn't want him to think it. "It's just an old piece," she said calmly, adjusting Edward's sleeve back over it. "Nothing important." Isaiah didn't call her out, but he didn't believe her either. He stepped back again, putting space between them. The room fell quiet once more. The heater clicked. The wind screamed outside, and for a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Until a faint sound echoed from down the hallway outside. Footsteps. Slow, measured. Then, stopping. Right outside Isaiah's door. Isaiah's body stiffened instantly. His head turned. Margaret noticed too. Her hand moved slightly, gripping the edge of the blanket. Edward opened his eyes. Another sound. A soft scrape, like someone shifting their weight. Listening. Isaiah took a slow step toward the door, every muscle in his body tightening. He didn't reach for the handle, didn't speak, just stood there waiting. The silence stretched. Then, a shadow passed briefly under the door, and the footsteps moved on. Fading. Gone. No knock this time, just presence, and then absence. Isaiah stayed where he was for a few seconds longer, listening. Nothing. He turned back slowly. Margaret was watching him now, her calm expression just a little more strained than before. Edward sat up straighter. "You expecting someone?" Isaiah asked quietly. Margaret shook her head. "No," she said again, but this time, it didn't sound as convincing. Isaiah studied them for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Get some rest," he said. But as he turned away, walking back toward the kitchen, one thought settled deep in his mind. This wasn't just a couple who got lost, and whatever they were running from, it hadn't stopped looking. Isaiah didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen, the weak yellow light buzzing overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked walls. A half-empty mug of coffee sat untouched in front of him, gone cold long before he even noticed. Every now and then he glanced toward the living room. Edward lay stretched across the couch, the blanket pulled up to his chin, his breathing steady but heavy with exhaustion. Margaret sat beside him at first, upright, alert. But sometime after midnight, even she had leaned back, her eyes closing in brief, careful intervals, as if she didn't trust sleep enough to fully give in. Isaiah noticed that too. She didn't rest like someone who felt safe. Outside, the storm had quieted a little, but the wind still carried through the empty street, low and restless. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, then faded. The kind of night where anything could happen, and often did. Isaiah leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. He replayed the moment at the door again in his mind. The knock, the desperation, the hesitation in Margaret's answers, and that shadow under the door. He had seen too many things in his life to believe in coincidence. Something was off. The clock ticked past 2:17 a.m., then 3:03. At 3:26, Isaiah heard something again. Not a knock, not footsteps this time. Something softer. A faint crunch outside, like snow shifting under weight. He froze. Slowly, he stood up, careful not to make a sound. His boots pressed quietly against the floor as he moved toward the window. He lifted the curtain just an inch. The street looked empty, but not untouched. Fresh tracks cut across the snow, newer than the storm should have allowed. Deep, slow, purposeful, leading toward the building, and stopping right below his window. Isaiah's eyes narrowed. He held the curtain there, watching, waiting. A long second passed, then another. Nothing moved. But that feeling, that same heavy, watching silence pressed in around him. He let the curtain fall. Behind him, a voice spoke quietly. "You see it too." Isaiah turned. Margaret was awake. Not startled, not confused. Awake. She hadn't been sleeping. Her eyes met his in the dim light, steady, sharp. Edward stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Isaiah stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Those tracks weren't there before." Margaret nodded once. "No," she said softly. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Isaiah asked. For the first time, there was tension in her face that she didn't hide. Not fear, not exactly. More like calculation running out of room. She looked at Edward, then back at Isaiah. "We told you the truth," she said carefully. "Just not all of it." Isaiah let out a quiet breath. "Figured." Another pause. The heater clicked off suddenly, plunging the room into a deeper silence. Margaret pulled the blanket tighter around Edward, almost instinctively, then stood up slowly. Her legs were still weak, but she held herself upright with a kind of quiet dignity. "They think we still have something," she said. Isaiah frowned. "Who's they?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation, Isaiah saw it clearly. This wasn't just about being lost. "They're not good people," she continued, "and they don't stop easily." Isaiah crossed his arms. "You owe somebody money?" Margaret shook her head. "No." "Then what?" She looked at him, really looked at him, as if measuring something deeper than the question. Then she said quietly, "We trusted someone we shouldn't have." Isaiah's jaw tightened slightly. That part at least he understood. "And now they think you got something they want," he said. Margaret nodded. "Yes." "Do you?" Another pause, longer this time. Then, "No," she said. But again, not convincing. Isaiah exhaled slowly through his nose. "People don't follow you through a snowstorm for nothing," he said. Margaret didn't argue. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window, stopping just short of it. She didn't look outside. Didn't need to. "They won't come in," she said quietly. "Not yet." Isaiah's eyes sharpened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "They're not sure yet." "Sure of what?" "That we're here." Isaiah let out a short, humorless breath. "Then we better hope they stay unsure." Margaret turned back to him. "And if they don't?" The question hung in the air, heavy, unanswered. Isaiah looked at Edward, then back at her. "You should have gone to the police," he said. Margaret gave a small, tired smile. "We tried." That told him everything he needed to know. Isaiah ran a hand over his face again. Of course they had. And of course it hadn't helped. The system didn't always work the way it was supposed to. He knew that better than most. A faint noise echoed again outside, this time closer. Isaiah's body went still. Margaret's hand tightened at her side. Both of them listened. The sound came again. A slow step. Then another, right outside the building. Isaiah moved quietly to the door, stopping just short of it. He didn't open it. Didn't speak. Just stood there, listening. The presence lingered. Then, a soft tap, not a knock, not loud enough to be heard from far away. Just enough. Intentional. Isaiah's heart beat slower. He didn't move. Didn't answer. Behind him, Margaret whispered, "Don't." He didn't need to be told. Another tap. Then silence. Long, heavy. And then, footsteps again. Fading. Gone. Isaiah stayed there for a long moment before stepping back. He turned to Margaret. "They're testing," he said. She nodded. "Yes." Isaiah glanced at Edward again, then back at her. "Then we got a problem," he said quietly. Margaret met his eyes. "No," she replied. "We have a situation." And somehow, the way she said it made it sound even worse. The room fell into a silence that didn't feel empty. It felt loaded. Isaiah stepped away from the door, but he didn't relax. His shoulders stayed tight, his eyes still moving between Margaret, Edward, and the faint outline of the window where the storm pressed against the glass. "They're not just testing," he said quietly. "They're waiting." Margaret didn't argue. She lowered herself back onto the couch beside Edward, her movements slower now, more deliberate. The strength she had shown earlier was starting to fade again, replaced by a quiet exhaustion that seemed deeper than the cold. Edward stirred, blinking awake, confused for a moment, before his eyes found Margaret. "They here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not inside," she said gently. He nodded once, like that was enough for now. Isaiah watched them. There was something in the way they spoke to each other, short, coded, almost practiced, like this wasn't the first time they'd had to ask that question. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a few feet away. "I think we're past half-truths," he said. "If something's coming to my door in the middle of the night, I deserve to know what I'm standing in." Margaret looked up at him. For the first time since they'd met, she didn't try to soften it. "You're right," she said. Edward shifted, pushing himself upright with effort. His hands were steadier now, but the lines on his face looked heavier, like they'd been carved deeper overnight. Margaret took a slow breath. Then she spoke. "My son-in-law," she said, her voice calm but weighted. "We trusted him with everything." Isaiah didn't interrupt. "He handled our finances," she continued. "Our property, investments, paperwork we didn't fully understand. He said it was easier that way." Edward let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "We thought we were simplifying our lives," he added. "Turns out, we were handing them over." Isaiah leaned against the wall again, listening. Margaret's eyes drifted for a moment, as if she could still see the life they'd lost. "A month ago," she said, "he told us we were moving. Said he found us a home, closer to family, better care, safer neighborhood. He showed us pictures, numbers, documents." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Let me guess. None of it was real." Edward shook his head. "Not a single piece." Margaret continued. her voice tightening just slightly. He sold our house, transferred our savings, used our names on papers we never truly read. By the time we realized something was wrong, it was already gone. Isaiah's jaw clenched. How much? He asked. Edward didn't answer right away. Margaret did. Everything. The word hung in the air like a weight. Isaiah exhaled slowly. And the people outside? He asked. That him? Margaret shook her head. No, she said. He's gone. Then who? Edward looked at Margaret. She nodded once. People he owed, Edward said quietly. Or people he worked with. We don't know which, but they think we have access to something he left behind. Isaiah frowned. Do you? Margaret met his eyes again. No, she said firmly this time. Isaiah studied her. This time, he believed her. But they don't believe that, he said. No, she replied. The wind rattled the window again, softer now, but still there. Isaiah pushed off the wall and walked to the small table, grabbing his phone. He stared at it for a moment, then looked back at them. You said you went to the police. Margaret nodded. They asked questions, she said. Filed reports. Told us to be careful. That's it? Isaiah asked. Edward gave a tired smile. We're not exactly high priority, he said. Isaiah looked down at his phone again. He knew that feeling. Being overlooked. Pushed aside. Handled just enough to be dismissed. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. So what now? He asked. Margaret hesitated. Then quietly, we leave. Isaiah shook his head immediately. Not tonight. We can't stay here, she said. We've already put you at risk. Isaiah looked at her, something firm settling in his expression. You were already at risk, he said. Difference is now you're inside. Edward leaned forward slightly. And if they come back? Isaiah didn't answer right away. He walked to the door again, checking the lock, then the chain. Simple things, old habits. Then he turned back. They won't get in easy, he said. Margaret watched him carefully. You're not afraid? She asked. Isaiah let out a small breath. I've been afraid before, he said. This ain't new. There was no bravado in his voice, just truth. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Then something in her expression softened, not out of pity, but recognition. You've been through things, she said quietly. Isaiah gave a small shrug. So have you. The heater clicked again, filling the room with a steady hum. For a brief moment, it almost felt normal. 3 people, sharing a space, trying to figure out what came next. Until a sharp knock echoed through the hallway. Loud, clear, not desperate like before, not hesitant, confident. Isaiah's head snapped toward the door. Margaret's breath caught. Edward went still. Another knock, slower this time, deliberate. Isaiah didn't move right away. His eyes narrowed. Stay here, he said quietly. He stepped toward the door, each movement controlled. Another knock, then a voice calm, firm. Detroit police, open up! Isaiah froze for just a second, then looked back at Margaret. Her face had gone pale. Not with fear, with something worse. Recognition. And in that moment, Isaiah realized this situation was about to get a whole lot bigger than he thought. The knock came again. Firm, patient, certain. Detroit police. Sir, we need you to open the door. Isaiah stood still for a heartbeat, his hand hovering inches from the lock. The sound of the wind outside had quieted. like even the storm was waiting to see what he would do next. Behind him, Margaret's fingers tightened around Edward's sleeve. "Isaiah," she whispered, her voice thin. "Be careful." He gave a small nod without turning. Then slowly, he unlatched the chain. The door creaked open just enough for him to see two officers standing under the flickering hallway light. Their coats were dusted with snow, their expressions neutral, but their eyes were already scanning past him. "Evening," one of them said. Mid-40s, steady voice, badge catching the light. "We got a call about a possible welfare concern." Isaiah leaned against the doorframe, not opening it wider. "From who?" he asked. The officer's eyes flicked briefly down the hallway. "Neighbor. Said there might be elderly individuals here who aren't being properly cared for." Isaiah let out a quiet breath through his nose. Of course. He didn't need to look to know exactly which neighbor that was. "They're fine," Isaiah said calmly. "They asked for shelter. I gave it." The second officer, younger, stepped slightly to the side, trying to get a better view inside. "Mind if we come in and confirm that?" he asked. Isaiah hesitated. Not because he had anything to hide, but because he already knew how this worked. One step inside, one assumption made, and suddenly, the story wouldn't belong to him anymore. "They're resting," Isaiah said. "It's been a long night." The older officer's tone softened, but only slightly. "Sir, we're not here to cause trouble. Just need to make sure everyone's safe." From behind Isaiah, Margaret spoke. "It's all right," she said. Her voice carried a quiet authority that didn't match her situation. Isaiah glanced back. She gave him a small nod. He stepped aside. The officers entered slowly, boots leaving faint, wet prints on the worn floor. Their eyes moved across the room. The heater, the blankets, the small kitchen, the chipped table. Then they saw Edward and Margaret. "Ma'am," the older officer said gently, "can you tell me your name?" Margaret met his gaze directly. "Margaret Whitman," she said. "And this is my husband, Edward." The officer crouched slightly, keeping his tone respectful. "Are you here by your own choice, ma'am?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked at Isaiah, then back at the officer. "Yes," she said. The younger officer glanced at Isaiah again, as if measuring that answer against something unspoken. "Do you have identification?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. Edward shifted beside her. "We lost our belongings," he said quietly. The room grew still again. The older officer stood up slowly. "All right," he said. "We're going to need to involve Adult Protective Services. Standard procedure in situations like this." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "They don't need that," he said. "They just needed a place to stay the night." The younger officer straightened. "That's not your call, sir." Isaiah looked at him, something sharp flashing in his eyes, but it faded just as quickly. He'd seen this before. Different uniform, same tone. The older officer raised a hand slightly, easing the tension. "It's just a check," he said. "Make sure they're not being exploited. Make sure they have proper care." Margaret let out a slow breath. "We understand," she said. Isaiah turned to her. "You don't have to agree to that," he said quietly. She gave him a small, tired smile. "Sometimes," she said, "agreeing is the only way to avoid something worse." Those words landed heavier than anything else that had been said. A few minutes later, another knock came, this one softer. A woman stepped in, clipboard in hand, her expression professional but distant. "Adult Protective Services," she introduced herself. "Name's Karen Mitchell." She moved through the room with quick, efficient glances, her pen already moving. "Mr. Brooks," she said without looking up. How long have they been staying with you? Just tonight, Isaiah replied. And you're not related? No. She nodded, writing. Do you receive any compensation for their care? Isaiah let out a quiet, almost disbelieving breath. No. Karen finally looked up. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. Sir, she said, we've had cases where individuals take advantage of vulnerable adults. It's our job to ensure that's not happening. Isaiah's voice stayed calm. I understand your job, he said, but you're looking in the wrong place. Margaret spoke again, her tone firmer now. He's telling the truth, she said. This man opened his door when no one else would. Karen gave a polite nod. I appreciate that, ma'am, she said, but we still need to follow protocol. Edward leaned forward slightly. We're not in danger, he said. We chose to be here. Karen's pen paused, then resumed. Even so, she said, given your situation, it would be safer for you to stay in a monitored facility, at least temporarily. Isaiah stepped closer. They don't need a facility, he said. They need time. Karen shook her head. They need protection, she replied. The word hung in the air like a verdict. Isaiah looked at Margaret. Her eyes had softened again, not with fear, but with resignation. She reached for his hand. Her grip was weak, but steady. You've done more than enough, she said quietly. Isaiah shook his head. This isn't right. I know, she said, but sometimes right isn't what decides things. Edward stood slowly, leaning on the arm of the couch. I think we should go, he said. Isaiah looked between them, between the officers, between the woman with the clipboard already preparing paperwork. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder, like the warmth he had fought to create was being pulled out piece by piece. Just like that? He asked. Margaret stepped closer. You gave us something we didn't have, she said softly. A night where we weren't invisible. Isaiah swallowed. That's not enough. For now, she said, it has to be. The officers waited. Karen checked her watch. Time, apparently, had already made its decision. Isaiah stepped back slowly, his hands falling to his sides. He didn't argue again, didn't raise his voice, didn't fight. Because somewhere deep down, he already knew how this part usually ended. As Margaret and Edward were guided toward the door, Margaret turned once more. Their eyes met, and in that quiet, fleeting moment, Isaiah understood something that made his chest tighten. This wasn't over, not even close. The hallway swallowed them slowly. Isaiah stood frozen in the doorway as Margaret and Edward were guided out, their steps careful, unsteady, like each one cost them something. The cold rushed in the moment the door opened wider, biting into the warmth that had barely managed to exist inside that small apartment. Snowflakes drifted in through the gap, melting against the floorboards. Margaret turned once more before crossing the threshold. Her hand lifted slightly. Not quite a wave, not quite a goodbye. Something quieter, something heavier. Then she was gone. The door shut with a dull, final click. And just like that, the room felt empty in a way Isaiah hadn't expected. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the door as if it might open again. It didn't. Outside, the faint echo of boots faded down the stairwell. A car door slammed. An engine started. Tires pushed through snow. Then silence. Isaiah exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the dim light. The heater buzzed weakly behind him, still fighting a losing battle against the cold. He turned back into the room. The blankets were still draped over the couch where Edward had sat. The cup of soup on the table had gone untouched. a thin layer of film forming on top. The chair Margaret had used was slightly pushed back, like she had just stepped away for a moment. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. Isaiah walked over to the table and picked up the cup. It was already cold. He set it back down carefully. His eyes drifted to the door again. "They'll be all right," he muttered under his breath. But the words didn't sound convincing, even to him. A sharp knock broke the silence. Isaiah stiffened. Not the police this time. Different rhythm, faster, more impatient. He opened the door again. His landlord stood there, coat wrapped tight, face already twisted with irritation. "Thought I heard cops out here," the man said, peering past Isaiah without asking. "You bringing trouble into my building now?" Isaiah stepped slightly into the doorway, blocking his view. "They were just doing a check," he said. The landlord snorted. "Yeah, because I got a call too. Someone saying you got old folks in there. No paperwork, no nothing. That's liability." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "They asked for help. I gave it." "That's not your job," the landlord snapped. "Your job is paying rent, which you're already behind on." Isaiah didn't respond. The landlord leaned in a little closer, lowering his voice, but not his tone. "I don't need problems in this building, Isaiah. Especially not ones that bring cops and social workers knocking at my door." "They're gone now," Isaiah said quietly. "Good," the landlord replied. "Let's keep it that way." He paused, looking Isaiah up and down. "You're a decent guy," he added, though there was no warmth in it. "But decent don't pay bills." Then he turned and walked off, his boots echoing down the hallway. Isaiah closed the door slowly. The lock clicked into place again. He stood there, staring at it. Same door, same room, same life. But something inside him had shifted, and he couldn't quite name what it was yet. He moved back toward the couch and sat down heavily, the worn cushions sinking under his weight. The silence returned, thicker this time. He rubbed his hands together, trying to bring warmth back into them. But it wasn't just the cold anymore. It was the feeling of something unfinished, something wrong. He looked at the spot where Margaret had been sitting. "You said it wasn't over," he murmured. And for the first time that night, he believed it. A faint sound came from outside. An engine. Not the same one as before. Lower. Smoother. Isaiah frowned slightly and stood, walking toward the window. He pulled the curtain back just enough to look out. Through the falling snow, a dark car sat parked across the street. Not a police car. Not a neighbor's beat-up sedan. Something else. Clean lines. Black. Expensive. Its headlights were off. But it wasn't moving. Isaiah watched it for a long moment. Then the driver's side door opened. A figure stepped out, coat pulled tight, face obscured by shadow and snow. The person didn't approach the building, didn't knock, just stood there, looking, at his building, at his window. Isaiah let the curtain fall back into place. His pulse slowed, but not completely. He stepped away from the window, his mind turning over everything that had happened. The police. A PS. Margaret's words. Edward's silence. The car. None of it felt random anymore. It felt connected. Like pieces of something larger. Something he hadn't been meant to see. Isaiah sat back down, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "You two weren't just lost," he said quietly to the empty room. He stared at the floor. "You were running." The wind picked up again outside, rattling the window slightly. And somewhere in the distance, another car engine started. Isaiah looked up. The room felt colder than before, not just from the weather, but from the realization settling in his chest. Whoever had been looking for them hadn't stopped. And now, they knew where to look. The thought didn't leave Isaiah. It followed him into the silence. It sat beside him on the worn couch, settled into the corners of the room, pressed against the thin walls like the cold itself. He didn't turn the lights on. Didn't bother. The dim glow from the street lamp outside spilled through the curtain, casting long shadows across the floor. The same floor where, just an hour ago, two people had been fighting to stay warm, to stay unseen. Now it was just him. Isaiah leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight. His mind replayed everything. The knock, Margaret's voice, Edward's trembling hands, the police, the questions, the way Margaret had said those words. Sometimes right isn't what decides things. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his face. "You should have done more," he muttered to himself. The words came out low, heavy. He looked up at the couch again. The blanket was still there, folded awkwardly where Edward had been sitting. Isaiah stood and walked over, picking it up slowly. It still held a faint trace of warmth. Or maybe he just imagined it. He held it for a moment longer than necessary, then placed it carefully back down. The apartment felt colder now, not just physically, something deeper. Like whatever warmth had filled the space earlier hadn't just left, it had been taken. Isaiah moved to the window again, pulled the curtain back just enough to look out. The street was quieter now. The car from before was gone. Only tire tracks remained, faint lines pressed into fresh snow. Isaiah stared at them. "They were watching," he said under his breath. Not a question, a realization. He let the curtain fall, stepped back. The heater clicked again, struggling. Isaiah walked into the kitchen and opened the cabinet. Nothing much inside. A few cans, half a loaf of bread. He grabbed a glass and filled it with water, taking a slow drink. His reflection in the window above the sink caught his eye. Tired, older than 42. Lines in his face that hadn't been there before the war. Or maybe they had, and he just hadn't noticed. He stared at himself for a moment. "You did what you could," he said quietly. But something in his chest pushed back against that. Was it enough? He set the glass down. The question lingered. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling something loose along the building's edge. Isaiah walked back into the living room, sat down again, and waited. He didn't know for what. But sleep didn't come. Hours passed. The sky outside shifted slowly from black to a dull, heavy gray. Snow continued to fall, softer now, like the storm was finally running out of anger. Isaiah hadn't moved much. At some point, he must have closed his eyes. But it hadn't been rest. Just brief moments of silence before the same thoughts returned. A knock came again. Lighter this time. "Morning." Isaiah blinked, straightening slowly. His body protested, stiff from sitting too long. He walked to the door and opened it. It was the same neighbor, Mrs. Keller, late 60s, always watching. She stood there with her arms crossed, her expression tight. "Saw them take those people out last night," she said without greeting. Isaiah leaned against the doorframe. "Yeah." She looked past him, scanning the apartment like she expected to find something left behind. "You shouldn't get involved in things like that," she said. "People like that. They bring trouble." Isaiah didn't respond right away. Then, "They were just cold," he said. Mrs. Keller scoffed. "Nothing's ever just anything," she replied. "You think folks end up like that by accident?" Isaiah met her gaze. Sometimes they do. She shook her head, unconvinced. Well, she said, stepping back. Don't say I didn't warn you. She turned and walked off, her slippers dragging slightly against the floor. Isaiah watched her go, then closed the door again. The lock clicked. Same sound, same rhythm. But now, it felt different. He leaned his forehead lightly against the door, eyes closed. They weren't like that, he said quietly. Not to Mrs. Keller, not to anyone. To himself, because deep down, he knew. The way Margaret spoke, the way Edward held himself even in weakness, the way they looked at each other. That wasn't random. That wasn't nothing. Isaiah stepped away from the door, walked back into the room, and for the first time since they left, he allowed himself to feel it fully. The loss, not of something he had for years, but something that had only existed for a single night. A connection, a purpose, a moment where he hadn't just been surviving. He had mattered, and now it was gone. The silence pressed in again. He sat down slowly, looked at the empty chair. They said it was safer, he murmured. His fingers tightened slightly. But safer for who? No answer came. Only the quiet hum of the heater, the soft fall of snow outside, and the lingering feeling that something had been taken from him as much as it had been taken from them. Isaiah leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His eyes stayed there for a long time, and somewhere in that stillness, a question began to form. Not about what had happened, but about what came next. Because if they had been running, and if someone had been looking, then this couldn't be the end. It was just the part where everything looked like it was over, before it changed again. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a dull steel gray. The snow had slowed, but the cold had settled deeper into the streets, into the brick walls, into the bones of everything that had nowhere warm to hide. Isaiah hadn't left his apartment. He hadn't turned on the TV, hadn't picked up his phone, hadn't tried to distract himself from the quiet. Because the quiet felt honest, like it wasn't pretending to be anything other than what it was. Empty. But as the hours passed, something underneath that emptiness began to shift. A tension, a pull, like the world outside was moving again, and sooner or later, it would reach him. It started with a sound, low at first, barely noticeable, then clearer. Engines, more than one. Isaiah lifted his head slowly, his eyes drifting toward the window. The sound didn't belong in this neighborhood. Not here. Not on this street. He stood and walked over, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see, and froze. 3 black vehicles had turned onto the block. Not police. Not delivery trucks. Clean. Silent. Expensive. They moved in a slow, deliberate line, tires cutting clean tracks through the snow. One stopped across the street, then another, then the third. Doors opened. Men stepped out. All dressed the same. Dark coats, composed movements, eyes scanning without hurry. They didn't look lost. They looked like they had arrived exactly where they meant to be. Isaiah's pulse slowed, but not in relief, in recognition. "This is it," he said under his breath. Not fear, not yet, but something close. He let the curtain fall. The knock came seconds later, not rushed, not aggressive, precise, measured, like whoever stood on the other side already knew he would open the door. Isaiah walked toward it, each step steady, controlled. He didn't check the peephole, didn't need to. His hand rested on the handle for a moment. Then he opened it. A man stood there, early 50s, tall, clean-cut, presence that filled the narrow hallway without effort. His coat was dark, tailored. Snow clung lightly to his shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice it. Behind him, two others stood a few steps back, waiting, watching. The man's eyes met Isaiah's, sharp, direct, but not hostile, not yet. "Isaiah Brooks?" the man asked. His voice was calm, controlled. Isaiah didn't answer right away, just looked at him, measured him the same way he was being measured. "Who's asking?" Isaiah replied. The man studied him for a brief moment, then reached into his coat, not quickly, not threateningly, and pulled out a simple leather card holder. He opened it, turned it slightly. A name, a title. Isaiah didn't recognize the company, but he recognized the weight behind it. Richard Whitman. The name hung in the air before Isaiah could even process it fully. The man closed the holder. "I believe," Richard said quietly, "you let my parents into your home last night." Everything in Isaiah stilled. Not just his body, his thoughts, the room behind him, the street outside, all of it. Paused. For half a second, the world stopped making sense. Then, it did. Margaret. Edward. The way they spoke. The way they carried themselves. The way they didn't belong where they had been. Isaiah exhaled slowly. "They said their name was Whitman," he said. Richard nodded once. They told the truth. A silence settled between them. Not tense, not comfortable. Something else. Something heavier. Isaiah stepped slightly to the side. "You better come in," he said. Richard didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, his eyes moving across the apartment with a single glance. Not judging, not dismissing, observing, taking it in. Behind him, the others remained in the hallway. The door closed. The lock clicked again. Same sound. But this time, everything felt different. Richard walked a few steps into the room, stopping near the couch. His gaze fell on the folded blanket, the cup on the table, the small signs of a night that had already passed. "They were here," he said. Isaiah nodded. They were. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "They disappeared 3 days ago," he said. "No calls, no trace, nothing." Isaiah leaned against the wall, arms crossing loosely. "They didn't say that part," he replied. "No," Richard said quietly. "I imagine they wouldn't." He turned slightly, facing Isaiah fully now. "Do you know what happened to them after they left here?" Isaiah shook his head. "Police came, then social services. They took them." Richard's expression shifted. Not surprise. Something sharper. "Which facility?" he asked. Isaiah hesitated. "I don't know," he said. "They didn't tell me." Richard nodded slowly, like he had expected that answer. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, "Tell me," Richard said, his voice quieter now. "What did they say to you?" Isaiah looked at him. Really looked this time. Not at the suit. Not at the presence. At the man underneath it. The concern. The urgency. The edge of something personal. "They asked for help," Isaiah said simply. "So I gave it." Richard's eyes didn't leave him. "And nothing else?" Isaiah thought for a moment. Then, "Your mother," he said. "She said something." Richard leaned in slightly. "What?" Isaiah's voice softened. "She said, I was the only one who treated them like people." The words landed harder than anything else in the room. Richard looked away for a brief second, just long enough for something to pass through his expression, before it was gone again. When he looked back, it was different. Not just controlled, decided. "You have no idea," Richard said quietly, "what you've done." Isaiah shook his head. "Feels like I lost more than I helped," he replied. Richard stepped closer. "Then you're the only one who sees it that way." Another silence. But this one felt like it was building towards something larger than either of them had expected. Outside, the engines still idled. The snow kept falling. And inside that small, worn apartment, the balance of everything Isaiah thought he understood about his life was beginning to shift. Richard Whitman didn't sit. He remained standing in the center of the room, as if the space itself wasn't meant to hold him for long. His eyes moved once more, taking in the cracked paint near the window, the worn carpet, the faint hum of a heater that sounded like it might give up at any moment. "This is where they stayed," he said, almost to himself. Isaiah nodded. "Right there," he replied, gesturing toward the couch. He barely moved. She kept watching everything. Richard's lips pressed together slightly. "That sounds like her." There was a quiet weight in the way he said it. Not just recognition. Memory. Isaiah leaned back against the wall again, arms loosely crossed. "They didn't tell me much," he said. "Just enough to keep me from asking too many questions." Richard gave a faint, humorless smile. "They've always been like that," he said. "Especially my mother. She tells you exactly what you need to know, and nothing more." A pause, then. "They were taken advantage of," Richard continued, his voice steady but tighter now. "Someone close to the family. My sister's husband." Isaiah's brow furrowed slightly. "Family?" he repeated. Richard nodded. "Trusted him, gave him access, control over certain assets, accounts, legal authority in some areas." He exhaled slowly. "And he used it." Isaiah said nothing. He didn't need to. He'd heard enough stories like that to know how they ended. "He drained what he could," Richard went on. "Moved money, locked them out of their own accounts, then disappeared before we realized what was happening." Isaiah's eyes narrowed slightly. "So they weren't just lost," he said. "No," Richard replied. "They were cut off." The words sat heavy in the air. Cut off. From money, from protection, from the world they had always lived in. Isaiah glanced at the small kitchen, at the empty cabinets, at the chipped table. "And they ended up here," he said quietly. Richard followed his gaze. "For a few nights," he said. "We tracked their last known location to a hotel downtown. After that, nothing." Isaiah let out a slow breath. "They didn't look like people who'd been on the street long," he said. "They weren't," Richard replied. "Which is why it's difficult to imagine what those days were like for them." Isaiah nodded once. "I can imagine," he said. Richard looked at him, and for the first time, really saw him. Not just the man who opened a door, but the man who had been living in this reality long before that night. "You probably can," Richard said quietly. A silence settled between them again. Different this time. Less guarded. More understood. Then Richard reached into his coat again. This time he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, turned it toward Isaiah. A photo. Margaret. Edward. Standing in front of a large home, sunlight behind them, both smiling in a way Isaiah hadn't seen. "They were supposed to be at a foundation event that night," Richard said. "When they didn't show, we started looking." Isaiah studied the image. They looked whole. like people who had never known cold nights or empty rooms. He handed the phone back. "They didn't look like that anymore," he said. Richard nodded. "I didn't expect them to." Another pause, then, "My mother left a message," Richard said. Isaiah looked up. "What kind of message?" Richard hesitated for the first time. Not uncertainty, but something heavier. Then he reached into his coat again. This time he pulled out a small recorder, old-fashioned, simple. He held it in his hand for a moment, then pressed play. Static. A faint rustle. Then Margaret's voice. Tired. Soft. But unmistakably clear. "If you're hearing this," she said, "then we've probably been found." Isaiah's chest tightened. "We're all right," her voice continued. "Or at least, we were for one night." A pause, then. "There was a man. He didn't ask who we were. Didn't ask what we could give him. He just opened the door." Isaiah looked down slightly. Richard didn't take his eyes off him. "He treated us like we still mattered," Margaret said in the recording. "Like we weren't just a problem to solve or a burden to move somewhere else." Another pause. Longer this time. "If something happens to us," she added quietly, "find him. His name is Isaiah Brooks." The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before it. Isaiah didn't speak, didn't move, because there was nothing to say. Richard lowered the recorder slowly. "That message was time-stamped early this morning," he said, "after they were taken from here." Isaiah finally looked up. "They knew you'd find it," he said. Richard nodded. "They know me." A breath passed between them. Then Isaiah asked the question that had been sitting beneath everything. "Are they safe?" Richard's jaw tightened again. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I will." Not hope, not guesswork, a promise. Isaiah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good," he said, because for the first time since the door had closed, that answer felt like it might actually mean something. Richard slipped the recorder back into his coat, then reached into another pocket. This time, he pulled out a folded document. He stepped forward and placed it gently on the table. Isaiah frowned slightly. "What's that?" Richard met his eyes. "A start," he said. Isaiah didn't move to pick it up. "I didn't do anything for money," he said. "I know," Richard replied. "That's why this matters." Isaiah looked at the paper, then back at Richard. Something in his chest shifted again. Not discomfort, not resistance. Something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. Outside, the engines finally quieted. The snow slowed again. And inside that small, worn apartment, the story that had started with a single knock in the night was unfolding into something far bigger than Isaiah had ever expected. Isaiah stared at the document on the table. He didn't touch it. Not yet. The paper felt heavier than it looked, like it carried more than words, like it carried a decision. Richard Whitman stood across from him, quiet now, giving him space. Not pushing, not explaining, just waiting. Isaiah let out a slow breath and finally reached forward. His fingers brushed the edge of the paper. Then he picked it up. The print was clean, formal, legal language that didn't belong in a place like this. He scanned the first few lines. A property transfer, debt settlement, his name, Isaiah Brooks. He frowned slightly, reading slower now. "What is this?" he asked. Richard stepped a little closer. "It's your building," he said. Isaiah looked up sharply. "My... what?" "The one you're standing in," Richard clarified. And the one next to it. And the lot behind it. Isaiah shook his head immediately. No, he said. No, I didn't ask for this. I know you didn't. Then I can't take it. The words came out faster now, firmer. Because that part of him, the part that had learned to survive without expecting anything, didn't trust this. Didn't trust anything that came too big, too sudden. Richard didn't argue. Didn't try to convince him. He just nodded once. Then don't, he said. Isaiah blinked. What? Don't take it, Richard repeated calmly. Not like that. A pause. Then, use it. Isaiah's brow furrowed. Richard gestured lightly toward the room. You said they needed time, he said. You were right. He stepped closer to the window, looking out at the street. There are people in this city who don't get time, he continued. People who fall through cracks because no one stops long enough to open a door. Isaiah said nothing, because he knew that was true. He'd lived it. Richard turned back to him. My parents, he said, spent their lives building things, companies, foundations, programs meant to help people they would never meet. A faint shift in his expression. But in the end, none of that mattered as much as one night. One door. Isaiah looked down at the paper again, then back at Richard. You're asking me to run something, he said. I'm asking you to continue what you already started, Richard replied. Another silence. But this one felt different. Not heavy, not tense, open. Isaiah walked slowly across the room, the document still in his hand. He looked at the couch, the chair, the space where Margaret had stood. You think I know how to do that? He asked quietly. Richard didn't hesitate. I think you're the only one who does. Isaiah let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. I couldn't even keep them here, he said. That wasn't your failure, Richard replied. That was the system doing what it does. Isaiah looked at him. Feels the same either way. Richard nodded. I understand that. And somehow, Isaiah believed him. Not because of the money, not because of the cars outside, but because of the way he said it. Like he had seen something break before. Isaiah looked back at the document one more time, then slowly placed it down on the table. I'll do it, he said. Richard didn't move, didn't react, just waited. But not like this, Isaiah added, a small shift in Richard's posture. What do you mean? Isaiah straightened slightly, his voice steady now. If this becomes something, he said, it stays open. Richard watched him closely. No conditions, no paperwork that turns people away, no questions that make someone feel like they don't belong. A pause. Anyone who knocks, Isaiah continued, gets a chance to come in. The words settled into the room. Simple, but unshakable. Richard studied him for a long moment. Then, he nodded. Done. No negotiation. No hesitation. Just agreement. Isaiah exhaled slowly. Something inside him shifted again. Not doubt. Not fear. Something steadier. Purpose. Outside, one of the car doors opened. A voice called quietly down the hallway. Richard glanced toward the door. They've located them, he said. Isaiah's chest tightened. Where? Facility downtown, Richard replied. Temporary placement. They're stable. Isaiah closed his eyes briefly. Relief, sharp, immediate. When he opened them again, Richard was already moving toward the door. I need to go, he said. But this, he nodded toward the paper, We'll finalize it later. Isaiah didn't stop him, didn't try to, because something told him this wasn't the end of their story either. Richard reached the door, then paused. He turned back one last time. My mother was right, he said quietly. Isaiah frowned slightly. About what? Richard held his gaze. You didn't treat them like a problem, he said. You treated them like people. A small pause. That's rare. Then he opened the door and stepped out. The cold rushed in again, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The door closed, the lock clicked, and Isaiah stood alone once more. But not the same kind of alone. He walked slowly back to the table, looked at the document again, then around the room, at the space, at what it had been, and what it could become. Outside, the engines started again, one by one, then faded into the distance. Isaiah moved toward the window and pulled the curtain aside. The street was already returning to normal. Snow. Silence. Nothing extraordinary, except everything had changed. He let the curtain fall, turned back into the room, and for the first time since that knock in the night, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to happen. He felt like he was part of it. The next morning came quieter than the night before. No sirens, no heavy knocks, no strangers asking questions. Just soft light filtering through the curtain, catching the edges of the room in pale gold. The snow had finally stopped, leaving the street outside still and clean, like the city had been given a chance to start over. Isaiah stood in the middle of the apartment, hands at his sides. He looked around slowly, at the couch, at the table, at the space that had held something real, even if only for a few hours. Then he moved, not fast, not dramatic, just steady. He folded the blanket again, this time carefully, set it at the end of the couch, picked up the empty cup, rinsed it in the sink, cleared the small table. Each movement simple, but deliberate. Because now to us, it meant something. A knock came at the door. Isaiah paused, not tense, not hesitant, just aware. He walked over and opened it. It was Richard again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Margaret stood beside him, Edward just behind her, both dressed in clean coats now, their posture stronger, their presence restored. But their eyes were the same. And when Margaret saw Isaiah, they softened immediately. Good morning, she said gently. Isaiah didn't answer right away, because for a moment, he wasn't sure if this was real. Then Edward stepped forward, extending his hand, stronger this time, steadier. Thank you, he said. 2 words, but they carried everything. Isaiah took his hand, firm grip, no hesitation. You're all right, Isaiah said. Margaret smiled faintly. We are now. They stepped inside. No hesitation, no uncertainty, like the door had never been closed to them. Isaiah looked at Richard. You found them fast, he said. Richard gave a small nod. They weren't as far as we feared, he replied. Just misplaced. The word hung there for a moment. Misplaced. Like something valuable that had been set down in the wrong place and almost forgotten. Isaiah glanced at Margaret. She caught it and shook her head slightly. Not forgotten, she said softly. Just tested. Isaiah didn't argue, because somehow that felt closer to the truth. They moved further into the room. Margaret's eyes took everything in again, the same way they had the night before. But this time, there was no fear behind it, only quiet understanding. "You kept it warm," she said. Isaiah looked at the heater. "It tries," he replied. Edward let out a soft chuckle. "Reminds me of a place we had once," he said. "Long time ago, before everything got complicated." Richard glanced at him, but didn't interrupt. Margaret turned back to Isaiah. "We heard what you said," she said. Isaiah frowned slightly. "Said?" "About the space," she continued. "About keeping the door open." Isaiah glanced at Richard. Richard gave a small, almost invisible nod. Isaiah looked back at her. "I meant it," he said. Margaret stepped closer. "So do we," she replied. A pause. Then, "Whatever this becomes," she added, "it should stay what it started as." Isaiah met her gaze. "A place where someone can knock," he said. "And be seen," she finished. The words settled into the room, simple, but complete. Richard stepped forward slightly. "We can start immediately," he said. "Repairs, staffing, legal setup." Isaiah shook his head gently. "Not all of that," he said. Richard raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Isaiah looked around the room again, then back at him. "It starts like this," he said. "One room, one door." A pause. "Then we build." Richard studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right." No pushback, no correction, just agreement. Margaret smiled faintly. Edward stepped closer to the window, looking out at the quiet street. "Funny," he said softly. "Same snow, same buildings, but it feels different now." Isaiah followed his gaze. "It is," he said. "Not because the world had changed, but because something inside it had." A silence settled over the room again, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was full of something steady, something quiet, something that didn't need to prove itself. Then, another knock came. All four of them turned. The sound was lighter than the first one that night, less desperate, but still uncertain. Isaiah looked at the door, then at Margaret, then at Edward, then at Richard. No one spoke. He didn't need them to. Isaiah walked to the door, placed his hand on the handle, and for just a second, he remembered that first knock, the cold, the doubt, the question. He opened the door. A man stood there, mid-30s, thin coat, red hands, tired eyes. "Sorry," the man said, almost backing away already. "I heard someone might be helping people here." Isaiah didn't hesitate. He stepped aside. "Come in," he said. The man blinked, surprised, then stepped inside slowly. Warm air met him. Light. Space, people. Not questions, not judgment. Just a door that had opened. Isaiah closed it gently behind him. The lock clicked again. Same sound. But now, it meant something else. Not separation, not fear, but shelter. Isaiah turned back into the room. Margaret met his eyes. A quiet nod. Edward smiled faintly. Richard said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. Snow melted slowly along the edges of the street. Life continued, but inside that small apartment, something had begun. Not a business, not a transaction. Something simpler and stronger. A place where a single act of kindness didn't end. It multiplied. And somewhere down the line, someone else would knock. And someone would answer, just like he did. When Isaiah Brooks opened that door again, without hesitation, for a stranger with frozen hands and nowhere left to go, it wasn't just a moment. It was proof that what began on that first desperate night had never really ended. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is keep showing up, even after being misunderstood, even after being hurt. Because real strength isn't in what people say about you, it's in what you choose to do anyway. So today, if you see someone standing out in the cold, literally or figuratively, don't overthink it. Just take a second, like Isaiah did, and open the door in whatever way you can. Have you ever helped someone, not knowing who they really were or what it might lead to? Tell me below. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one coming that might change the way you see a single decision forever.